You are listening to Build What's Next Digital Product Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Lucas, and at Method, our vision is to connect technology with humanity for a simpler digital future. Join us as we speak with leading experts to discuss industry trends, best practices, and emerging technology that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences.
Hey everybody, welcome back. This is part 2 of Build What's Next. I'm here with Jeff and MG talking through developer portals and API as a product. Part 1, we tackled kind of the moments of truth for developer experience when it comes to portals, as well as for the teams owning that. For the second half, we want to talk about the organizational dynamics, governance, a little bit of security. We'll get into a little API lifecycle management of what's the realities of the day-to-day of running an API developer portal. And so, Jeff, you hit on a couple things in part 1 around, hey, if you're not ready to have a team that's going to answer help tickets, like don't even get started. What are other things that people might underestimate the importance of when it comes to operating and managing a developer portal?
I think the second piece I can't stress that enough. I stressed it pretty firmly in a previous segment, but beyond that, the long-term maintenance beyond just the production support, you mentioned it at the tail end of the previous segment, which was versioning. So you have to have a good versioning strategy. That strategy is both a definition, meaning how long will I support a given API, in what manner after I make changes to it. It's having that governance around the fact that we won't break APIs. We will instead introduce new versions. You can have major versions and minor versions, a minor version not requiring a change on behalf of the customer, a major version requiring a change on behalf of the customer. You have to give them time to accommodate that change. And when I say time, we're talking about 12 to 18 months, if not longer, because updating their code for your API is not going to be their primary concern. They're building products and doing things on their own. This is just spike work for them. So having that process in place and then ensuring the proper communication around the versioning, as well as constant maintenance window updates, anything requiring action on the customer. Like, for example, if you're changing your server TLS certificates in such a way that maybe some customers, depending on how they're validating your certificate, whether or not they need to make a change, those are also some other areas that you need to consider.
Yeah. I like that a lot, especially the 12 to 18 months, because I think that's a lot longer than a lot of people would think. And it makes you pause in terms of how you do API design and development in the first place of, if we're going to introduce a breaking change, like what are the implications of that? And that decision probably weighs a little bit more heavily. And it also, the importance of, not getting things perfect, but getting things right the first time. And like MG in part 1, you mentioned API design a little bit and the importance of being really good at the fundamentals of API design. And MG, maybe I pick up there of what's just the organizational kind of discipline that company needs to have around good API design, if you can pick up from where kind of Jeff left off there.
Yeah. So when it comes to good design, one is consistency. You have naming standards. You're naming your equality error messaging. So very clear standard error messages that help your developers understand what they did wrong, ways to fix that. Those are really just a couple of key items. And then I'm gonna loop back because Jeff has made it clear, and I just want to tie back into the support mechanism, right? The ability to get help when you have implementing it according to the documentation, you've read their messages and you still have a problem. How do I get help?
Yeah.
And so again, from an internal perspective, you likely have access to the team. And so you may not have a structured of a process there, but externally, again, to Jeff's point, having a team that can help answer that. I think that's pretty key.
Yeah, we've hit on this concept of support, but I think also with this concept of API as a product, and Jeff, you've talked about the API business product over versus the API engineer. There's now the dev portal team. Now we've introduced the concept of a support team, but When it comes to accountability and responsibility of ownership as an API, that is, quote, API as a product where, that API may be an externalized developer API. It might be something that's also used internally and it's sitting in an API developer catalog. There might be different versions of it, but how do you shake out just the roles and responsibilities of like who is making the decisions on the future of that API, where you have all these different parties with potentially competing interests and not as many resources as you might like in an enterprise?
Yeah, great question. Again, it goes back to my comment earlier about you've got on one side the business line that owns the capability that is being exposed by the API and is often exposed in other ways. And then you have the engineering team that's building the thing out. You have to have something in the middle. And what you have in the middle needs to understand APIs and needs to understand products. So they need to bring both the product and business acumen that comes along with product management, and they need to bring the technical acumen of an engineer, and specifically an API engineer. It's a difficult skill set to find, but I term it as API product manager. You really need API product managers. They end up being the liaison between the developers and the business line. They coordinate with the business line to understand the capability, and then they spec it out into an API, and very oftentimes generally manage the development team as a product manager to build that API, to maintain it, to write the documentation, and so forth. So that API product manager has ultimate accountability for it. The fuzzy area is often that the API product manager and the associated development team are usually sitting a layer up from the development team that built the lower level underlying systems and platforms that API then calls and orchestrates across to achieve whatever that business outcome is that the API call initiates. And that business line product team is accountable for that. But if you get your support model, like I talked about earlier, and having ticketing, the support requests flow down from an L1 team through the API product team and then down into the business line teams or the backend systems.
We're going to come back to one of the things you mentioned about the ways in which heavily distributed architectures have made this both easier and harder in some cases. This somewhat maybe mythical API product manager that you just mentioned, because I don't think every organization has that construct. Like, does that person, do they report into the business? Do they report into the API portal team? Are they part of the engineering organization? Are they part of just a general product organization? And I know, listen, we're consultants here, so the answer can be it depends. I mean, I know that's going to be the answer, but like, what are the pros and cons of where that person's potential loyalty sits at the end of the day, I guess, in the organization? And like, what are the different models that someone should be thinking about in terms of making that decision?
Yeah, we can link it a bit to the upcoming topic of centralization versus decentralization. But in my experience, that team is best removed from the engineering team because the engineering team is stronger on the technical acumen, but not the product acumen. But then if you take it all the way over to the business line product team, they just don't understand APIs well enough. So the way that I've seen it work from an initiation, growth, maturity standpoint is that you have to start it within a digital organization, ideally. So there's typically a digital organization that is focused on digital transformation. You stand up an API COE or an API digital team, and that team then collaborates across the various business lines that want APIs, and that team brings the API expertise. That team typically ends up building the initial set of APIs up to a certain point. It could be the first 3, it could be the first 100, it could be 6 months, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. It really depends on the organization. But the idea is they come in, they build out the governance, they build out the framework, they build out the portal, they build out the initial APIs centrally And then as the business lines see how it's done, they can slowly either on that skill set specifically to start taking that on by applying the framework, governance, rules and procedures, models, everything about support, governance, documentation, portal, et cetera. They can start applying and using all that since all that work's done and it's reached a state of maturity. Or you can start to federate out the digital organization that stood up and built all those things and start sending one or two people over to this business line and one or two over to that, to then plant that seed to then grow in the business lines. And then those business line product teams own it. So they would have for example, back to the payments example, the money movement product manager, and then the sub product manager, which is the API money movement product manager.
Yeah. I like that a lot. And when we're doing org design with folks, one of the questions I always ask, and it's a hard question, is what is the biggest problem in this exact moment that we need to solve for? And to some of the things that MG has said, if the biggest thing that we're trying to do is be really excellent at socializing and monetizing and exposing an API, that's not really a skill set that you want multiple business units to have to develop independently of each other. It's also not necessarily a skill set that you want to house in your engineering teams, because to your point, there's going to be teams building the API for the developer portal, the teams building kind of the underlying, and you don't want to expose your architecture in that way to the business necessarily. And so having this team that they have a core skill set and it's knowing how to take an API to market, knowing the level of granularity to take that API to market, knowing how to tell that story, knowing how to support the life cycle, knowing the implications of the readiness of a team to bring an API to market and what the right time is, and like, hey, here's going to be the total cost of ownership, not just like, hey, this seems like a good idea at the time. I really like that because it is a very different skill set than you'll see unless you have a highly technical product manager. That's not necessarily going to be in the product manager skill set. If you don't have that role, you're going to end up with a project manager or a program manager in between the dev team and the business trying to manage it anyway. So I think it's one of those roles that if you don't have it, you're going to end up accidentally having it. You're just going to have someone who it's really not their priority ending up playing that role. You mentioned an API COE there, and MG, we've done some work around API COEs in the past for companies. I guess lessons learned and like, where's the hidden pain points in helping stand up an API COE as someone's getting this going? Like, what are those gotchas, I guess, of the implications on the development team for this ownership model?
Really, first of all, buy-in from the entire org. And ways that has shown up to be challenging is that the internal teams that own infrastructure, for example, not prioritizing the availability of the APIs has led to really developer challenges in getting things done. So a mindset and understanding that these COEs, ultimately, your customers are your developers, right? And so treating them as such and understanding that their ability to access, utilize these environments is actually critical to actual productivity. So that is something that we've seen actually pretty consistently, in that internal developers' needs are not treated the same as external.
Yeah.
And so you need to sort of understand that as you look at these COEs. And then the other is, we've talked about the documentation. I think what we've seen consistently is that initially the engineers have been asked to write documentation, which is clearly not their strong suit. And so you really see challenges in terms of the ability for folks to understand what these APIs do, and hence you have an adoption problem.
Yeah.
And so
It's a delicate subject because I don't want to criticize engineers. It's just, apologies for interrupting. I'll let you get back.
no, please.
Engineers do things a lot better than product people, and product people do things a lot better than engineers.
That's
the
right.
mistake thinking that they can both do each other's job, because they can. But back to you.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And quite frankly, if you ask most engineers, that's not what they want to be doing anyway. So it's like no harm, no foul there. I think that, again, when you have the COE really looking at the API from a product perspective, if you do that, then you say, okay, what are our best practices in terms of how we stand up and think about product? Are we bringing in many of those same practices and staying up to COE? Are we thinking about monitoring and metrics and KPIs? Are we talking about what those are and how we're going to measure those, right? Are we going to put the things in place to make sure that we have those? Do we understand who all of our key partners are in setting this up? I mentioned the infrastructure teams, right? You have engineers, you have DevOps, right? So you have all of these teams that are going to be critical in order to help these APIs be stood up, operated, managed, maintained, and work. So really understanding that ecosystem as well, the number of teams that need to be a part of the conversation is also, at times we see there's some gaps there.
Yeah. I think coming in organizations and looking at this, you do run headfirst into Conway's Law a lot of times, where their existing org structure and the way the APIs have been set up are a result of that. And so I know just talking to teams, you end up with two teams. They've both built an API. It's fit to serve their purpose. There's a third team that needs that API, and teams 1 and team 2 fight over one whose API becomes the new foundation for that, or they fight over, hey, team 3 should use team 1 versus team 2. And it's important to have that discipline to say like, okay, we now have more than 2 teams that need this API. It is now a shared service, and we have a structure and an ownership model and a governance model for managing that, and changing the mindset of like, hey, as an owner of this shared service, I am now a servant of these other teams. Like my customers are these teams that consume this set of shared services. Like I'm giving up a little bit of control of my roadmap to meet the organizational demand as we go through. And I've seen the other side of this in organizations that are trying to roll out some of the scaled agile type stuff, where they have product teams that are doing their own PI planning, and then the cloud team's doing their own, and then the shared services team is doing their own. But how can the shared services team plan until they know what everyone else needs for that upcoming increment and for that plan? And so you have to start figuring out, hey, in the organization, for every decision we're making, like who is the hero versus who is the supporting actor of that? And it really changes how those teams orient themselves. But going into an organization and they have 5 different auth teams because they've done a bunch of M&A, like that's a really difficult fight to arbitrate for the organization, or they have 6 different Git account APIs. Like that's not a fun situation, but that's going to be the reality of trying to do this, is having the team and the org construct ready to catch these new shared services and really keep the confidence of the developer team that this API is going to do what I need it to be. I'm still going to have a voice in it. It's going to be supported well. I'm going to have the resources I need. It's going to meet my architectural standards that I need for the organization. Like there's a lot of trust that goes into that. And I think people underestimate just like the change management of getting people who have been used to owning their full application, soup to nuts, controlling their own destiny, being willing to give up part of that ownership to other teams in order to do that. So, Jeff, I'd be curious your thoughts of seeing, I guess, maybe the emotional side of an API COE and like working with kind of developers and teams and rolling that new model out.
Yeah, so a couple of points. Your example, one of your main examples, touched a lot on coming into an org that already has a lot of APIs and there being some infighting over which one should be used and so forth. I won't dig too deep into that other than to say, if you establish a COE with dedicated product managers that are specific to API product managers and have that acumen, and then give them authority to make decisions on which API to select based on their knowledge and skill and assessment, that really is the best way to handle it. In terms of the emotions, I will make 2 points to that. The first point is that you really need a good governance process that involves a review if you're not centralizing the actual build of the API. So if you have a COE that's there to just provide governance, and then your actual development and product management is happening out in the various business lines and in those product teams who aren't necessarily API experts, you really need to make sure that you enforce the reviews of the API design and the documentation and the standards. You need to enforce those very early, because the number one thing that you'll find if you don't do that is somebody's ready to go to production. They get snagged by whatever governance net caught them before they were given approval from the release management team to go and they say, hey, did you have this approved by the API COE? And then by then it's too late because you'll get I didn't know I needed approval. The customer was promised this by next week and we've got a $10 million contract on the line if we can't get this out. So I'll fix it after I publish it. How about that? Want to get into that place. So making sure that you evangelize the COE out to all the appropriate development teams as early as possible, like pre-design phase. So they not only know that you exist, but what are all the checks and balances and API security and everything that they're going to have to adhere to very early so that that situation can't happen. And then the other problem that I see a lot, which can be difficult to solve for, and it's really an organizational challenge, is that when it comes to API standards and design, you want all the APIs for your company looking like they were built by the same company. You don't want a patchwork of APIs. And the problem with that is there is no single best way to design APIs. Someone may say, well, REST is the best way. Well, even within REST, do you use camel casing? How granular are the APIs? Do you do post for everything because of security concerns? Or do you use all the HTTP methods? The standards and patterns, the way that I would explain it is they just need to be consistent and make sense. The problem with that is since there's no right answer, you need that one set of standards that everybody follows. So when a customer comes and they implement 4 APIs from 4 different business lines, they generally have the same experience and everything feels intuitive and good. Problem is sometimes you get some developers on a particular team who are extremely opinionated and they may try to debate and say, no, that's not the right way to design. But the problem is there is no single right way to design. The important part is that it's consistent. So the only way that you can get around that, and I've seen that kind of debate stall for 2 years. Oh, we can't do it that way for X, Y, and Z reason, but X, Y, and Z is an overly technical reason that they know the business line people who are making the decision on whether to push or not will never understand. So they just have to trust, and it just goes on and on. You have to have top-down empowerment of that COE, that they're the decision makers.
Yeah.
And they set the standards.
I think on that last one, there's a healthy and there's an unhealthy side of evangelism in organizations. And especially once you do get to that top, the ability for your senior technology leaders and product leaders to be excellent at trade-off analysis and knowing where to be opinionated and not be opinionated. Because you said, hey, there's a difference between a rule and a standard versus a guideline. And the ability to see and know where to draw that line of like, what are we locking in versus what are we guiding people on? I think specifically on governance for teams, because listen, a lot of times these development teams, it's not just the API dev portal team that's going to have governance. They got to go to the security governance committee. They've got to go to the cloud governance committee. Maybe DevOps has their own governance committee. You can end up having to go to 4, 5, 6 different teams just during the design process, which is going to just clog everything up because of the sequencing of those things. Know some organizations that have multiple checkpoints for governance with single groups. When you're doing governance, looking at, hey, where are we doing governance by collaboration? If you can shift left and have the API COE team help provide that support in the beginning, or even better, if you have really good documentation and kind of that golden path, I guess, for teams of this is what it looks like, that can be super helpful. Because then your next stop is human-based governance, which is we're relying on an expert to look at something and say yay or nay. Nobody's going to be infallible. No 2 people are going to interpret exactly the same. And so there is risk to that. And I don't want to underestimate governance as code. The more of your governance that you can embed into the development process and you're giving teams like, hey, this is the type of fitness function that you're going to have to pass. This is what we're going to run on the API. These are the standards that you're going to have to meet. You remove that opinionated human process, and you also just remove the amount of time people stand around waiting for somebody to review something. Because what I've never seen in an organization is a bunch of solution architects sitting around with nothing to do. I've never heard an organization say, you know what, I have too much of solution architecture time. I wish they were busier. If anything, it is the major bottleneck that most people are trying to hire for. So the more of that enforcement and governance can be a documentation, a code thing, Now, again, in the beginning, you probably want more human centralization when you're starting out on this until you get some of those reps. But the sign of mature organization isn't how distributed and federated it is. It's how much that governance lives in the tooling, it lives in the documentation, it lives in the code. So I think some really good points on it's not a centralized or decentralized. It's how much do you centralize versus decentralize. But I love that you gave the power of either doing the work or governing the work to the team, and you have to have one or the other there. Two other questions. MG, you mentioned a little bit about API lifecycle management earlier. We've talked a lot about tooling. We've talked about support. If we look out over the next couple of years, how big of an impact is AI making on teams right now for the API development process or lifecycle management or just managing the dev portal in general versus where do you guys both see the opportunity for AI to help teams with the efficiency or the efficacy of a developer portal?
I think of it in a couple of ways, right? I think it's in terms of where the developer actually does their work and then the ecosystem supporting that work, right? So for example, obviously you have AI in assisting in the coding of the APIs. So as you can have code assist, test, maybe generation, validation, and obviously documentation. I think that's probably the lowest hanging fruit and where you likely will see teams adopt early and quickly. And I think, in fact, many already have. But as we talk about and think about security, right, having AI tools actually help us not wait until API is out in production, but actually look and begin assessing, validating, hey, is there a likelihood that we have a security issue here? So early identification of possible security challenges, I think is going to be a really interesting play for us to have. And then AI actually analyzing the metrics, helping you quickly ascertain and come up with, this is how folks are using it. Here's potential opportunity and or challenges.
Yeah. Jeff, your thoughts?
Yeah. Chat bots, search bots, bots to find a solution for a business problem are typically low-hanging fruit in the AI world. To plug into the code creation comment, I'll say one of the areas that I'm excited about AI on the code creation is that on some API portals, companies are adding SDKs. And I've been lukewarm about SDKs. I understand the value of providing them, but with the understanding that you're basically shifting the cost of development from the customer to your business to some degree. And while that can pay off, it doesn't necessarily always. And then you have to support and maintain not just the API, but the SDKs, in addition to the fact that not everybody's building things in the same programming language or even the same system if they're not using a programming language and they're doing like a service bus type of system. So I would say that using AI to help the customer generate code in whatever their native language is to consume your APIs, having that capability embedded into the portal, and then having that automatically be updated as you update your APIs, because it would kick off and it would go and check for the latest version of the API. It would generate the code in the target language. It would accommodate all changes that have been recently made in the API. I could see that as very beneficial. And then I'll also echo the comment about vulnerability and threat detection. There are a number of products that have come on the market recently that take the old sort of table stakes API gateway that's performing basic authentication and authorization and access control, taking that to the next level of actually looking for specific threats that are pattern based. Off the top of my head, Traceable AI would be a very good example of a product that does that.
Yeah. I think some really interesting things coming up. And a point there is, even if you're not using AI, I think we talked about discoverability and starting to think about making your APIs discoverable by AI. And so making sure that tagging and having that semantic layer that sits on top of it, that an LLM could come through and read and understand. And, you know, if someone's Googling in the future, like, what's the best API for this? And it's looking at 5 or 6 different APIs on the web and saying like, hey, here's a couple APIs from companies that do this. Like, that's probably not too far off in terms of discoverability. Guys, this has been an awesome conversation. I feel like we could probably keep going for another 90 minutes. I think Josh would kill me. And so, Jeff, we really appreciate the perspectives. And MG, thank you guys so much. This was a lot of fun. We didn't even get to the implications of distributed architectures and team structures on maintaining a dev portal. So, we'll see what the audience comes back with, and maybe we'll do a part 3 follow-up here soon. So really appreciate it, guys.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me. It was very fun.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.